This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Newbronham. Here are tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korea ready to deploy a team to Ukraine to monitor North Korean troop movements in Russia amid growing concerns over Moscow and Pyongyang's deepening military alliance. Taiwan braces for Super Typhoon Kong-rey. Tens of thousands of troops are on standby as officials warn of severe disruptions to transportation. China's Shenzhou-19 docked successfully with the nation's Tiangong space station, with the crew set to soon take over operations for the next 6 months. The latest earnings at China's largest state-owned banks rose as provisions dropped, but the sector continues to battle record low margins. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, we step into one South Korean village where its traditional houses are popular with visitors, local and foreign. But is the constant stream of tourists proving too much for the residents? South Korea is planning to send a team to Ukraine and monitor and analyze the deployment of North Korean troops in Russia. The move comes amid worries that Moscow's alliance with Pyongyang will escalate tensions that have broken out since the war erupted in 2022. South Korea's Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, says it is possible an advance team of North Korean troops may already be in the front lines of the war in Ukraine. This follows earlier reports that troops are also mobilizing towards the Kursk border region in western Russia. Seoul and its allies estimated at least 11,000 North Korean soldiers had been deployed. Concerns are further heightened with the presence of North Korea's top diplomat, Cho Son-hui, in Russia. This is her second trip to the country in 6 weeks. The Russian Foreign Ministry says Ms. Cho is holding strategic consultations with her Russian counterpart in Moscow. Reports suggest she could discuss the possibility of sending even more troops from Pyongyang. Seoul also reporting that Pyongyang has completed preparations for an intercontinental ballistic missile launch and is likely to test fire around the time of the US presidential elections in November.
7차 핵실험 가능성도 배제할 수 없다. 현재 북한의 핵실험장인 길쭉은, 한북 길쭉은 풍계리에서의 내부 준비는 거의 끝난 것으로 보인다.
Well, for more, we're joined by CNA's Im Young-suk reporting live from Seoul to us. Young-suk, South Korea and Ukraine have agreed to deepen their cooperation as a result of North Korea sending troops to Russia. What would such a cooperation look like?
Well, the presidential office here is saying that the Ukraine will be sending a special envoy to South Korea for the two sides to discuss this issue of North Korean troops in Russia and also see what, they can do together. Now, it's unsure exactly what, they will be discussing, but it's possible that the South Korean side will be getting a briefing from the Ukrainian special envoy on what's happening there. Although, as you just said, that South Korea here thinks that it is necessary to send its own team to analyze what's happening there, investigate the North Koreans, see exactly what the North Koreans are up to, especially their military activities. Now, also, some experts here are saying the two sides could be discussing what the next step should be, because right now we are unsure what else the South Korean government is planning to do. But, some analysts are saying it could be on how to get the North Koreans to stop the deployment, or even discuss ways on how to get many of the North Koreans soldiers who are in Russia now to give up their arms, surrender, or to even defect to Ukraine. In fact, there's a group of North Korean defectors here who used to serve in the North Korean military, seeking permission from the South Korean government to go to Ukraine and try to talk to North Korean soldiers and get them to leave Russia. Now, this group led by An Chanil, a North Korean defector who served in North Korea's military, says that the North Korean military veterans here in South Korea now understand North Korea's military culture, the psychological state of the North Koreans better than anyone else. And so they are in the best position to help try and stop the North Koreans from getting involved in this Ukraine war, because they feel that, they say they pity the North Korean soldiers who've been sent out to Russia, where it's a foreign land and they don't even know the language. There's one lawmaker, Park Chung-kwon, who defected to South Korea in 2009, even saying that, even telling the local media that he thinks South Korea should use the same method used along the borders here between South and North Korea to grab the North Korean soldiers' attention and get them to defect. And he was referring to the loudspeakers, the ones that the South Korean military here uses now to get the North Koreans to defect, because usually the loudspeakers will be playing Korean K-pop music, information about what's happening outside of North Korea, and he believes that that can help prevent the North Koreans from wanting to fight in this war. Now, according to the presidential office, North Korea has banned officers from using their mobile phones to try and prevent possible unrest within North Korea because of this deployment. And we're hearing reports that families of the soldiers deployed to Russia have been told that they have simply just gone for training. And so analysts here think that there could be some kind of unrest in North Korea, and a lot of the North Koreans are questioning why they're fighting in a war that's not theirs, and they're trying to keep, the North Korean government is trying to keep the news of the deployment very quiet.
The South Korean lawmakers are saying that they expect Pyongyang's seventh nuclear test sometime soon. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, they are saying that possibly a seventh nuclear test and also the launch of another ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. But, this is something that we have been hearing from the South Korean officials, even the Defense Intelligence Agency, many times in the past, and so far it hasn't happened. But because it is a sensitive time now, with the U.S. presidential elections around the corner, talk of the nuclear or the ICBM is starting to come out now. But, apart from the ICBM and the possible another nuclear test, South Korea is also looking out for North Korea to launch another military reconnaissance satellite, the spy satellite, very soon. It failed to successfully launch one last May. And so experts here think that North Korea has had some kind of help from Russia since then as part of the strategic cooperation, and that North Korea might have improved their earlier version and may want to test it out soon.
All right, thanks so much for those insights, Yeon-suk. That was CNA's Lim Yong-suk reporting from Seoul. Well, earlier we spoke to Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He told us about the significance of Western support for Ukraine's defense as Pyongyang deploys more troops to Russia.
I think there's a recognition that's finally dawning, maybe, on the Americans and their European partners that this war in Ukraine is but one campaign in a wider war that's being run by an axis of authoritarian states, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, in a coordinated and strategically aligned manner to challenge Western liberal democracy as a governance system. And Ukraine is but that first campaign. And so what you have now is North Korea entering the war. It's not a sign of Russian weakness. Actually, it's a sign of the growing risks posed by this axis of authoritarian states. I think Biden's comment in terms of Ukraine striking back is the right one. But I really do wish Biden would then follow through and say that the US is going to withdraw its constraints on Ukraine's ability to use US-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia. That is what really is needed to ensure that this threat of North Korean forces, which could grow quite dramatically, is defeated. If those North Korean forces enter the fight in Ukraine, then Ukraine has every right to strike. But it's not clear at all that the current constraints that are in place that prevents Ukraine from using US-supplied weapons against targets inside Russia have been removed. And what they're saying is no fresh constraints or limitations. So that's really vague and needs further clarification. But in terms of the actual tactical situation on the ground, I think what you're likely to see is those North Korean troops coming in alongside Russian troops in places such as Kursk, but also in the Donbass, to shatter Ukrainian defensive positions and force the Ukrainians back such that the Russians can then make rapid advances deep into the interior of Ukraine. A key city in that regard is a city called Pokrovsk, which the Russians are trying to capture. If the Russians brought in significant numbers of North Korean troops, potentially 10,000 North Korean troops, that could shatter Ukraine's defences. Russia could capture that town, and then they would have almost an open pathway into the heartland of Ukraine, including potentially Kiev. We are within, 7 or 8 days away from a US presidential election that could see the return of a Trump administration that is very clearly indicating that it will not support further military assistance to Ukraine. So Ukraine is facing not only a military threat on the front lines in the Donbass, now with the addition of North Korean forces that I think Putin has brought in deliberate timing to maximize pressure on Ukraine and the United States. But they're also facing the prospect of the US withdrawing its support for Ukraine. That could then leave them going into the winter very seriously short on munitions and weapons that would only grow worse and potentially see the Russians continue to advance. If the Europeans can't make up the shortfall, which is quite possible, then I think it's possible you could see Russia make decisive advances coming out of the winter of 2024-25 and potentially being in a situation where it could dominate Ukraine. So it does leave a very dangerous situation becoming realized. And I think the longer-term risk is that if Russia wins in Ukraine, if they emerge victorious as a result of these developments, then Russia would be emboldened then to take the fight to NATO itself and potentially threaten NATO in a year or so.
And amid all those escalating tensions, the US and South Korea have staged a joint live-fire drill earlier today. The exercise, which saw the deployment of Apache helicopters from both sides, took place at a training site north of South Korea's capital, Seoul, less than 30 kilometers away from the heavily fortified border with North Korea. Through the live firing, both militaries wanted to demonstrate their strong defensive posture on the Korean peninsula.
The purpose of today's exercise is to test the combat readiness not only of U.S. aviation, but also the ROC aviation and how we partner together.
Australia plans to increase its missile production in response to concerns over China's recent test of an ICBM in the South Pacific. Now, the country also plans to enhance its weapons stockpiles as the region enters a, quote, new missile age. Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy says Australia believes a strategic competition between the US and China is a key aspect of Australia's security environment. He emphasised that this competition is at its sharpest in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia will partner with a US-based weapons giant to make guided multiple launch rocket systems. This announcement follows China's test firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile in the Pacific last month. It was the first such test in 4 decades. Concerns about China's defense spending and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have led many U.S. allies to voice concern about a shortage in munitions manufacturing capabilities. Australia is among several Asia-Pacific nations significantly boosting defense spending. Coming up on East Asia tonight, the EU tariffs on China-made electric cars taking effect today after months of negotiation threats of Chinese retaliation and pleas from European car makers. We tell you what's at stake. China's largest bank report higher earnings even as margins languish at record lows. Welcome back, everyone, to East Asia Tonight. Now, Roland Lim is standing by with the very latest in the business news. And that latest news is the largest banks in China announcing their quarterly results, Roland.
That's right, Jill. It's a frenzied earnings day. And some of the country's banking titans report higher third quarter income. That's even as their margins continue to shrink. The rising profit stems from falling provisions, which helped to cushion record low net interest margins and slowing revenue growth. ICBC, China's largest bank, said its net income rose 3.8% on year. Agricultural Bank of China logged the highest rise in profit for the group at 5.6% on year. Now, net income at Bank of China climbed 4.4%, while the Bank of Communications reported a 1.2% gain. Now, China's $61 trillion banking industry has been struggling with record low margins, falling profits, and rising debt as they heed Beijing's directive to support the sluggish economy with cheap loans. These are offered to cash-strapped local government financing vehicles. To help alleviate the property slump, lenders were also told to cut mortgage rates. Last month, China unveiled its biggest package yet to shore up growth. This includes slashing policy rates and interest rates on $5.3 trillion of outstanding mortgages. Major banks cut their deposit rates earlier this month, the second time this year, as they try to salvage margins amid weakened profitability. A Standard Chartered Bank pledges to return at least $8 billion to shareholders by 2026 from a previous vow of $5 billion. Now, that's after it reported third quarter profit more than doubled from a year ago. The latest result beat analyst estimates as the lender recovers from China-related impairments. A pre-tax profit for the quarter jumped to $1.72 billion, beating the $1.49 billion average analyst estimate compiled by the bank. During the same quarter last year, the figure was $633 million, when Standard Chartered took a hit of nearly $1 billion from its exposure to China's property and banking sectors. The bank, which earns most of its revenue in Asia, also upgraded its operating income guidance growth this year to around 10%, from above 7% previously. Now, unlike its rival HSBC, which reported third quarter results yesterday, Standard Chartered did not announce a fresh share buyback. The London-headquartered bank said it's doubling investment in its wealth management business and will continue to reshape its mass retail business. Standard Chartered shares listed in Hong Kong closing nearly 3% after the report card was out. The bank's London shares, which started trading about 2 hours ago, also jumping more than 3% to reach their highest level in 9 years. Now, China is reportedly set to approve nearly $1.5 trillion in fresh borrowing costs as authorities seek to shore up the economy. Reuters reports some $840 billion in debt will be raised over 3 years to help local governments. Another $560 billion worth of bonds will be issued to fund regional governments' property purchases over the next 5 years. The report says lawmakers will likely approve the plan at a meeting next week. Officials are also expected to step up stimulus if Donald Trump wins the upcoming US election, as he has threatened to escalate import tariffs. Speaking of which, the European Union's higher tariffs on China-made electric vehicles take effect today. That means some Chinese EV exporters will pay as much as 45% in levies, leading to threats from SAIC Motor to file a lawsuit at the EU Court of Justice. China has slammed the bloc's decision, calling it a, quote, protectionist practice of unfair competition. And its Commerce Ministry says it does not agree with or accept the ruling. CNA's Tan Chiu-yi reports.
The European Union has moved to protect an industry crucial to its economy after a year-long high-profile probe into China's electric vehicle industry. On Tuesday, it gave the green light to extra tariffs, which differ depending on the manufacturer. State-owned Chinese automaker SAIC was slapped with the highest 35%. China's EV giant BYD, 17%. And these are on top of the EU's standard 10% duty on all imported cars. BYD is unfazed. Its Asia-Pacific GM tells CNA it's European consumers who will suffer.
对比亚迪来讲的话呢，其实我们会遵守任何一个国家的法律法规啊，那么把我们的这个技术用最好的方法啊，那么再提供给各个区域的这个消费者。其实影响的话呢，我想因为电动车、新能源汽车它是一个必然的趋势啊，或许可能这个速度或许会放缓啊，但不会停止。
In Europe, battery and plug-in hybrid electric cars made up about 3% of total passenger cars last year. And the tariff hike could keep this adoption rate low.
In most of these markets, EVs are highly expensive or are more expensive than traditional conventional fuel vehicles. And a further increase in tariffs, 40, 50, 100%, these are going to be significant to consumers' decision to purchase a vehicle.
The EU is not alone here. Canada and the United States have recently slapped much higher tariffs of 100% on Chinese EV imports. Whether it's protectionism or competition, at least one economist says the global EV fight could in fact be good for the planet.
Every country in the world feels threatened by China's production of electric batteries, electric vehicles, and they want to put up industrial policy that will help their industry. Let me say the thing that economists are not allowed to say. What's so bad about that? If America has industrial policy that makes it produce better batteries, better electric vehicles, move towards renewable energy, and in doing that, it makes Europe and China feel very uncomfortable, and they put on even more industrial policy to improve their batteries and electric vehicles, I say from the sidelines, right on. This is how we're going to save the world, through inadvertent cooperation.
China is hitting back. It's filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization and has started its own anti-dumping investigations into European brandy, dairy, and pork. Tan Chiu-yi, CNA, Singapore.
Let's check in on the market. Stocks in Greater China ended lower as investors digest a possible fiscal boost to shore up growth and the likely impact of the EU's heavy tariffs on Chinese electric car imports. Now, EV stocks taking the brunt of the impact in Hong Kong, shares of NIO leading the percentage losses, down by nearly 6.6%. China's state-owned EV maker SAIC down nearly 1%. While China's leading EV brand, that's BYD, well, it also ended 0.67% in the red. Auto giant BYD is reporting third quarter results later today, and some analysts forecast it may have surpassed Tesla's revenue for the first time. Its EV sales in Europe jumped 19% in August, despite a demand slowdown after the EU imposed provisional tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in July. The auto giant set a new record for monthly deliveries in September, selling more than 400,000 vehicles. China's Xiaomi says it has delivered more than 20,000 SU7 EVs in October, just months after launching its first car. Despite being known for smartphones and home appliances, Xiaomi reiterated plans to deliver 100,000 SU7 vehicles by the end of November. The company is fiercely engaged in the EV race, competing with the likes of Tesla. When Xiaomi released the basic version of the SU7, it cost about $4,000 less than Tesla's cheapest car in China. The move pushed Tesla to reduce its price by $2,000. Xiaomi first revealed plans to make cars back in 2021 and began building a dedicated manufacturing plant the same year. Xiaomi says it is now taking pre-orders for the high-end sports version of its EV, the SU7 Ultra. The price will start at just above $114,000. Investors reacting positively to the results. Xiaomi's Hong Kong share is closing about 0.75% higher, reversing earlier losses. Meantime, Toyota Motors' global production fell for an 8th straight month in September, as both sales and output declined in its two biggest markets, that's the US and China. Output for the world's biggest automaker fell 8% on year in September to around 827,000 vehicles. Production in China tumbled 19%, while that in the US, well, it fell 14%. US output suffered from a production and delivery suspension of two models due to an airbag issue. Toyota resumed production of the models in the 21st of October. The Japanese carmaker also reported falling sales for September, and it continues to face heavy pressure in China, where consumers are shifting to electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids sold by Chinese brands. Globally, Toyota's sales slid 7% on year to about 853,000 vehicles. The competition in China led numbers to fall 9%, while its US sales slumped 20%. The production and sales figures include its luxury Lexus brand. And that is the latest in business, Jill.
Roland, we're heading to Japan after the break. Another high court there rules that the government's ban on same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. South Korea ready to deploy a team to Ukraine to monitor North Korean troop movements in Russia amid growing concerns over Moscow and Pyongyang's deepening military alliance. Taiwan braces for Super Typhoon Kong-rey. Tens of thousands of soldiers are on standby as officials warn of severe disruptions to transportation. China's Shenzhou-19 docks successfully with the nation's Tiangong space station, with the crew set to take over operations for the next 6 months. Back to Kong-rey, it's strengthened into a super typhoon as it heads towards Taiwan. It's expected to make landfall tomorrow morning. Authorities are warning residents to brace for its impact. The storm, packing a maximum wind speed of 300 kilometers per hour, is expected to hit as the equivalent of a Category 4 hurricane. It is forecast to bring heavy rain and high waves, which officials warn could reach up to 6 meters in height. The island has issued a land warning and is taking precautions such as suspending work classes as well, and some ferry services and flights. Taiwan's defense ministry has put about 36,000 troops on standby. Now, this is what Kong-rey's trajectory currently looks like on that map there. Now, based on this, Taiwan fears its third largest county, Taitung, will be the worst hit. Ilan and Hualien are also preparing for potential landslides and debris flow. Parts of the Philippines also on alert, despite already scrambling to cope with the aftermath of Superstorm Trami, which killed more than 120 people last week. Kong-rey is not expected to be half as brutal as it passes close to smaller islands in northern Philippines. The typhoon is then expected to move further north, brushing along and making a possible landfall in China's Zhejiang and Fujian provinces, and bringing heavy rain to its financial hub, Shanghai. Southern China, meanwhile, still grappling with the after effects of Trami. Heavy rainfall from the storm's exit left many parts of Hainan province underwater. Incoming cold air and the storm's residual effects are intensifying rainfall. China Daily reports a student drowned in the resort town of Sanya, while in Qionghai, a mother and her child were washed away by flood water. In Tongchang County, 14 trapped workers were rescued. Classes in the region have been suspended across multiple levels, with no indication when they would resume. Kong-rey will be the third typhoon to hit Taiwan since July. As extreme weather events become more common and intense, there are fears among experts that existing infrastructure in cities is not enough to help mitigate potential storm-related damage. Climate change is causing seas to heat up, and warm water is fuel for more severe hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons. But the damage from a storm can be a lot worse if flood management systems like gutters and storm water drains are outpaced by a city's growth. Experts are predicting that flood damage will worsen by the end of the decade as urbanization continues across cities without enough infrastructure investment. China's Taiwan Affairs Office has suggested U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump could discard Taiwan should he win the 5th of November election.
美国究竟是在想要保台还是害台？相信大部分的台湾同胞已经做出了理智的判断，非常清楚的知道，美国奉行的永远是美国优先，台湾是随时可能从棋子变成弃子。
Beijing reiterated its disapproval of the U.S. decision to sell $2 billion worth of arms, including missile systems, to Taipei.
我们坚决反对美国向中国台湾地区出售武器，美方应当采取切实措施，恪守一个中国原则和中美3个联合公报规定，将美领导人不支持台独的承诺体现在具体行动上，停止武装台湾，停止向台独分裂势力发出错误信号。
U.S. Democratic candidate Kamala Harris has delivered a key campaign speech which her aides have touted as her closing argument to voters. Comes a week ahead of the November 5th presidential election and took place at the Ellipse near the White House in Washington, D.C. Now, the site is significant as it was where her Republican rival Donald Trump encouraged the Capitol insurrection on January the 6th, 2021. Ms. Harris urged voters to turn the page on the Trump era, saying the former president is in it only for himself. She called on voters to reject him, highlighting his alleged ill intentions should he win. Trump, meanwhile, responded to Ms. Harris's remarks by attacking her actions as vice president at a rally in Pennsylvania. He called his Democratic opponent a phony, citing her flip-flop over fracking. He also slammed her for the migrant crisis along the border with Mexico, accusing her of allowing an invasion.
Over the past 4 years, Kamala orchestrated the most egregious betrayal that any leader in American history has inflicted upon its people. She allowed this to happen to us. She allowed us to be invaded. We were invaded. This was a massive invasion of criminals. She has violated her oath, eradicated our sovereign border, and unleashed an army of migrant gangs who are waging a campaign of violence and terror against our citizens. It's vicious what's happening. They're killing our people.
Benji Haya, who was covering Harris's speech, breaks down the message she was trying to send.
A week to go until polls close, and this was Kamala Harris's big chance to offer her final pitch to Americans. This rally was attended by tens of thousands of people, with it focused on a future of freedom and hope, key themes in her campaign. But this speech was as much about symbolism as it was substance. The location, we're just a stone's throw from the White House behind me, the timing, the American flags, the signs saying USA. This was all intentional. It all was to send a message that, in the words of Kamala Harris, she is putting country above party, above self.
I pledge to you to approach my work with the joy and optimism that comes from making a difference in people's lives. And I pledge to be a president for all Americans. And to always put country above party and self.
She drew a stark contrast between her and former President Donald Trump, someone she called an unstable wannabe dictator. She said that he represents, quote, chaos and division, referencing the January 6, 2021 attack on the US Capitol building, and his more recent remarks, controversially, about going after his political opponents, people he brands as enemies from within.
He has an enemies list of people he intends to prosecute. He says that one of his highest priorities is to set free the violent extremists who insulted those law enforcement officers on January 6th. Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him. People he calls, quote, the enemy from within. America, this is not a candidate for president who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power.
She presented herself as a unifier, someone who can seek common ground, offer a different path, who can be a president for all Americans. That rhetoric was unsurprisingly lapped up by everyone that gathered here on Tuesday evening, but her mission would have been to reach out to the handful of undecided voters in those battleground states that could ultimately swing this election that is still very much on a knife edge. Benji Haya, CNA, Washington.
Coming back to East Asia, a Japanese high court today ruled in favour of same-sex marriage. The Tokyo High Court said the government's current ban on same-sex couples getting married is unconstitutional and discriminatory. This is the second time a high court has done this. In March, the Sapporo High Court said banning same-sex couples to marry and enjoy the same benefits as straight couples violates their right to equality and to enjoy the freedom of marriage. 6 lawsuits on marriage equality have been filed across Japan since 2019, but in all court rulings, compensation claims by plaintiffs have been denied. Still, the High Court's decision today has raised hopes in the LGBTQ+ community. Same-sex marriage is generally not legal across Asia, but Japan is the only member of the G7 that has not legalized it or provided any form of legally binding protection for LGBTQ+ couples. The country did adopt a law last year that isn't legally binding, but states any form of discrimination is unacceptable. Now, the news: China's Shenzhou-19 taikonauts have successfully arrived at the Tiangong space station after blasting off from the Jiuquan satellite launch center early this morning. Leading the 3-person crew is Commander Chai Su-che, who was on the Shenzhou-14 mission back in 2022. Joining him, Song Li-dong and Wang Haote, the latter being the country's only woman spaceflight engineer. This is China's 4th manned mission for its space station. It's part of China's plans to achieve its so-called space dream. Chinese state media says that the space agency has deemed the launch a complete success. The spaceship separated from the rocket and entered its designated orbit about 10 minutes after blasting off. The docking process then took about 6.5 hours. The crew was greeted by the astronauts from the previous Shenzhou-18 mission. The 6 of them are expected to live and work together for about 5 days to wrap up handover work. The Shenzhou-19 crew have their work laid out for the coming months. They'll be performing spacewalks, installing new equipment to protect the station from space debris, and carrying out multiple research and technical experiments over the next 6 months. Just ahead on East Asia tonight, we turn to a worsening spat between Ottawa and New Delhi, with Canada directly accusing the Indian Home Affairs Minister, said to be the Prime Minister's number 2 man, in deadly plots against Sikhs. And fears of excessive tourism have led South Korean authorities to implement a drastic measure at one village popular with visitors. Welcome back as we turn to an ongoing spat between India and Canada over the murder of a Sikh separatist, the latest being damning allegations coming from a top official in Canada. Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister David Morrison told members of Parliament that Indian Home Affairs Minister Amit Shah authorized a wave of violence targeting Sikh separatists on Canadian soil. And the High Commission of India in Ottawa and the Indian Foreign Ministry have not yet commented. And last year, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused the Indian government of being involved in the murder of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in British Columbia, sparking a diplomatic tit-for-tat between the two countries. India has called the allegations preposterous. Ishan Garg tells us what these latest allegations could mean for Amit Shah and what the reaction's been from the Indian government.
In terms of the allegations, the officials have said that India's Interior Minister Amit Shah, who's also considered very close to Prime Minister Narendra Modi himself, was the one who authorized quote-unquote wave of killings in Canada. That there's also allegations that Indian officials, Indian diplomats were involved in collecting intelligence on Sikh separatist leaders in Canada. And Washington Post in its article had also made allegations that Indian officials were working with an international crime syndicate headed by a man called Lawrence Bishnoi, who's currently incarcerated in an Indian prison, and using his criminal network, the Indian government was allegedly carrying out these attacks. Now, when these were first published and when Canada made the allegations, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, made the allegations first. India had said that these were completely preposterous, and it's highly likely that India is going to condemn these recent comments very harshly as well, because India has said that Canada has not shared with it any substantial piece of evidence regarding these allegations, though the Canadian side maintains that they have shared the intelligence and New Delhi did not act upon it. Well, as far as the recent comments from the Canadian officials are concerned, we have not yet seen a comment from the Indian Ministry of External Affairs or the Indian Interior Ministry, which is headed by Mr. Amit Shah, but we are likely to see, if any, we are likely to see strong comments against it, because India maintains its position that it is not involved in any acts of transnational violence, as has been alleged by Canada in the past. India has maintained its status, rather, on the international community, saying that it wants to cooperate with the Canadian officials if they provided any evidence. Now, there's a question about whether, if that evidence now was given to the Indian government, would New Delhi still cooperate? And many experts say that the relationship between India and Canada has soured so much that even if, assuming Canada hasn't given the evidence to the Indian government yet, if it does that now, New Delhi would probably not want to act with Ottawa, because the relationship is just in that bad position. And the recent comments that have come from Canadian officials, they're likely to worsen that relationship as well, because many in New Delhi have criticized Canada for making these allegations public way too early in the investigation, and thereby perhaps to some degree ensuring that India does not cooperate with this investigation. Of course, New Delhi says it is ready to do that.
To China now, it is said to have lost more than a third of its billionaires over the past 3 years, and that's based on a so-called rich list compiled by research group Hurun. The list has shrunk for an unprecedented third year running. Hurun says the number of dollar billionaires has plunged to some 750 from a peak of more than 1,180 in 2021. In the past year alone, the number of dollar billionaires declined by 16% when the renminbi depreciated only 2.5% against the dollar. The latest estimates were made at the end of August. The Chinese netizens, however, were quick to cast doubt on the data. This comes amid government crackdowns and weakness in parts of China's economy. Have a look, one post noting that how it is easier for the rich to make money compared to ordinary folk, asking where the problem was. The rich list itself came under scrutiny. One netizen questioned the reliability of the compilation. This post garnered more than 2,500 likes. One other netizen suggested that the ranking could be a way to stir online discussion and asked if the chart is still relevant after the recent stock market movements. More than 2,800 thumbs up on that comment. Back to the list itself. Taking the top spot for the first time is short video king Zhang Yibin, head of ByteDance. He owns the viral short video platform TikTok and Chinese equivalent Douyin. The 41-year-old is estimated to have a fortune of $49.3 billion, marking a 43% jump. Bottled water king Zhong Shanshan slipped to second place with $47.9 billion, losing his top spot for the first time in 3 years. The 70-year-old saw the biggest drop of the year, 24%, after a backlash against his business Nongfu Spring. Pony Ma Huateng, the founder of Tencent, the company behind the super app WeChat, ranked third on the list. Colin Huang, the founder of Pinduoduo and Temu, was fourth. Alibaba's Jack Ma came in 10th this year. The 60-year-old topped the list in 2020, but disappeared from public view after the government cancelled the blockbuster initial public offering of his financial group Alipay. The downturn in the number of super rich comes as the old guard of wealthy real estate developers suffered from the collapse in China's once booming property market. Smartphones and new energy entrepreneurs also featured more heavily on the list than they did 10 years ago. The average age of the top 10 entrepreneurs is 65 years old, an increase of 4 years from last year. The research group says 15% of the rich list lived outside mainland China and were based in Hong Kong, Macau or Taiwan. 30 members live overseas, particularly in the US and Singapore. In South Korea, authorities are introducing new curfew measures in Seoul's historic Bukchon-Hanok village to curb over-tourism. While many support the move, some residents fear the restrictions may drive away a source of livelihood.
It's a top destination for visitors to South Korea. Travelers come here to see its traditional houses. But some in Seoul's Bukchon-Hanok village say they're overrun with tourists. And now officials are taking action. The village will start a trial curfew in November. Bukchon-Hanok was made popular by a TV show 10 years ago and is now facing issues like noise, littering, and invasion of privacy. Last year alone, the village attracted around 6 million visitors. But its resident population is only about 6,000. Starting in November, tourists will have restricted access to certain areas from 5 p.m. to 10 a.m., and violators could be fined up to 100,000 Korean won, or about $72. The curfew will then officially start in March 2025. Chung Mun-han is head of Chongno district, where the village is located. He says local government will work with residents ahead of the official launch.
관광객들이 어느 정도 와도 이게 균형을 잡으면서 이제 정주권자들이 크게 불편이 없으시면 되는 거니까 주민들이라 그러니까 이제 실행을 해 나가면서 점점 좀 그 보완할 건 보완해 나가고 뭐 그러면서 좀 이제 지켜보면서 처음 시작하는 거니만큼.
Not all residents are convinced. One says the whole idea is not Korean.
대한민국은 그 이동의 자유가 있는 그런 나라인데 그런 것을 벌금으로 통제한다는 것은 너무 과한 조치이고 그러기에 앞서서 그 계도를 통해서
Tourists are divided over the curfew. Some dislike the idea of being fined for walking down a public street. Others say residents' quality of life is more important.
Yeah, totally agree with that, you know, where if tourists are being rude and disrespectful to the residents living here, that shouldn't be allowed. And yeah, there should be protections in place so their peace and sanity is preserved.
There are also concerns about enforcement, including how to tell tourists apart from residents, how to ensure foreigners pay fines, and how to address the language barrier.
Well, that's it for East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, you can also visit us on Facebook, YouTube, and X. Bye for now.